welcome everybody virtually to this evening's panel discussion. My name is Amy Sims and I am the events coordinator for the Care of Collections group. And I just wanted to welcome everyone on behalf of the Icon Modern Materials Network and the Care of Collections group as we're doing a joint event. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the Modern Materials Network. It was actually them that approached us with the idea of hosting this panel discussion on this topic. So we were just really happy to be a part of it and had a great time collaborating with them. So we just want to thank them for that. And I also wanted to let everybody know that as this topic has been, we've received so much interest in this topic, really popular, so many people have wanted to share, that we have decided to actually do a follow-on event to this panel discussion. We're actually in the process of organizing a one-day symposium, which will probably be at the end of July, where we will be inviting people to submit 20-minute talks, and we're also looking into producing either post-prints or pre-prints. So please keep an eye out on your iConnects, and I think we'll also be putting this on the disc list as well. And we really, really hope that we can get international participants, and we know that everyone's really interested, so we just really encourage everyone to share the amazing work that you've been doing. I just want to give a few housekeeping rules to start. Obviously, all the viewers' cameras and microphones are off, and we'll just keep cameras and microphones on for our panelists and our moderator. The format that we're working with this evening is the first half of the session. We have our fantastic moderator who will be asking some pre-decided questions to our panel, but then we also encourage you to, as the audience, to put questions in the Q&A box, because the second half of our session will be asking our panel questions from the audience, and our moderator will take those questions and ask the panel. So please feel free to use the Q&A box. We do have people that are going to be keeping an eye on it. If anyone's got questions or problems, please put it in the chat, and we've got people monitoring that. And so I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Vanessa Applebaum. She's a senior conservator at the Science Museum in London's small to medium-sized object store Blythe House, and is the co-chair of ICON's Modern Materials Network. Her research interests include the preservation of modern materials, particularly bioplastics, additive manufacturing, and the public understanding of the field of conservation. And I feel very happy to pass the evening over to her. So over to you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks very much. So before we get started, I'd also like to extend a welcome to everyone who's joined us this evening, and to those of you who are watching the recording of this event in the future. And that statement's kind of funny because it really highlights the virtual world that we are living in right now. So a few years ago, I don't think I could have imagined the concept of a virtual courier. And yet, the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic and the decline of travel has quickly made it a significant part of our lives in the arts and heritage sectors. Still, the idea of being a virtual courier for an object or a group of objects, as well as virtually condition assessing them, is a concept that very few, if any, people consider themselves to be true experts on. So it would be great to try to change that. Tonight, we are lucky to be joined by a fantastic group of people who will speak to us about their experiences with virtual couriering and condition assessing. And to attack this topic from all angles, we have representatives from registration, curation, conservation, and art tech departments. I think it goes without saying that the novelty of virtual couriering and the changing environment around it means that we might be hearing some thoughts that are still formulating and projects that are still works in progress. So let's all keep that in mind when we're heading to the chat and Q&A boxes. And so without further ado, I will now introduce you to tonight's transatlantic panel. So first, Adelina Vlas is the Associate Curator of Contemporary Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Prior to joining the AGO in 2014, she held curatorial positions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the National Gallery of Canada. Her area of specialty is post-war contemporary art with a focus on conceptual and time-based media practices. Most recently at the AGO, she organized the exhibitions Hito Style, This is the Future in 2019, and Hegu Yang Emergence in 2020. And I like your research assistant, Adelina. Carla Flack is a conservator of contemporary art, focusing on sculpture and installation art. She has worked privately and for various institutions in the UK, including the Science Museum and Historic Royal Palaces. She has worked for the Sculpture and Installation Conservation Department at Tate in London since 2012, where she has worked across all areas, but especially for the Loans Out program. And she is also a founding member of the Icon Modern Materials Network. Curtis Beeby has worked in the arts as a technician since he was 18. He trained as a blacksmith and carpenter. He worked as a fine art and museum technician for Artworks Exhibition Services before starting Art Tech. Art Tech covers all technical aspects of the arts and cultural industry, from touring shows of large sculptures, bespoke builds for display and transport, to making mounts for archaeological finds. Emily Link is Assistant Registrar of Exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and has 13 years of experience in nonprofit arts management. She has also served as Chief Operating Officer of Box 13 Art Space, which is a 100% volunteer-run gallery and studio space for the past 6 years. Rebecca Hellen is the Senior National Conservator of Paintings for the National Trust. Before, she worked at Liverpool Conservation Centre and is part of the Tate Conservation Department, with experience in loans at both Liverpool and Tate Britain. Finally, last but certainly not least, Rebecca Wallace is the Registrar at Historic Royal Palaces, where she is responsible for overseeing all aspects of collections management at the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace, Banqueting House Whitehall, Kensington Palace, Kew Palace, and Hillsborough Castle and Gardens in Northern Ireland. Prior to joining HRP, Rebecca was the Project Standards Manager, overseeing the development of procedures for the Collections Management System, and Senior Assistant Registrar in the Loans and Exhibitions Department at the Victoria and Albert Museum for 12 years. So thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. And now on to some questions. So in order to set the stage a little bit, I'd like to first ask each of you to speak for a couple minutes about your experience with either virtual couriering or condition assessing. Adelina, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today and to tackle this new topic that is kind of part of our future, I guess. So with my experience had to do with an exhibition that you mentioned, and it's Hegu Yang Emergence. It was scheduled to open at the end of April of 2020, and actually when we went in lockdown in mid-March, crates were already arriving. The space was being prepped, and we were faced really with this new reality of having to plan for an exhibition opening without an opening date. But of course, the lockdown and the closure of the museum allowed for some time for us to get organized and understand how we can actually address the issue of couriering and condition reporting when museum colleagues from mostly North America and Asia could not travel to supervise those steps in the process. So we had multiple meetings with our colleagues in the lending institutions, mostly on Zoom, of course, and by phone. And that was a great opportunity to meet kind of our colleagues beyond the curatorial, right? To sit down with our team and their team and try to coordinate a strategy of how to do those condition checks, and also the how to replace the physical couriering with a virtual one. And by default, we arrived at a solution that really was dictated by how we were already communicating with the artist, Hegu Yang, and her studio. She's an artist who's based in Berlin and Seoul, South Korea, so going back and forth. Her studio, we were working with her studio in Berlin, and we already had in place a WhatsApp group to kind of connect with each other and check in about details and try to have a very quick response, right? Avoiding the email and waiting for an email response. But if it was something that required an instant answer, WhatsApp provided that regardless of the time zone where the person at the other end of the line was. And we suggested that as the way forward for the virtual couriering, and that was something that was agreed upon. And as the crates were arriving from institutions in North America, we created those chat groups on WhatsApp, including members of the team at our end, as well as members of the team at the other end, because although we were open to the public and working, not all staff members were on site. So even as the curator installing the exhibition, I was not always on the floor supervising the more those first steps of the process. So that's how we worked through this challenge, and it worked quite well. And we'll see if it's here to stay for next exhibition.
Great, thank you. And Curtis, what about you?
Hi there. Thank you for having me on. From my perspective, we've probably had more experience of this pre-COVID, just cumulatively over the years, where something's gone wrong with couriers getting to an exhibition install, or it's just not been practical due to a number of different sites or objects being picked up in various different places. It is the organisations have deemed it better to do sort of remote condition checking, stroke couriering, depending on how you want to see it. It's always more awkward. A number of years ago, I had to do a touring exhibition for John Makepeace. We had lots of different pieces of furniture. He wanted to see the condition of them all, and they lots of them were in private hands. They were coming back into his fold, being restored, many of them, and then going back out into exhibition, and it just wasn't practical for him. So we did it. It was as we're doing it now, really, but with worse tech. And a lot where we didn't really have the Wi-Fi links and all the rest of it that we have now. It was just a rigorous telephone conversations, video where we could get it to work, and just meticulous notes and photographs. It's really awkward, but it's clearly going to be here to stay in one form or another. I could certainly see for the next few years, and if not, the industry might well decide to make a change in where budgets and just suitability is. As the industry gets used to it, it's going to become easier for it to happen. Rolling out, and but it's certainly possible, and Sorry, I'm waffling now, but I'll let you move on.
I think it's really interesting, actually, because it's always really important to be reminded that these things are not necessarily all new. We're always kind of working in more of a spectrum where, it's a nice reminder that this isn't totally new. We're just going to deal with it in different ways. So thank you. Now I'm going to move over to Carla. You can speak to us a little bit about your experience.
Hi, so I've worked at Tate for quite a few years, working specifically with loans, and that's loans going out of the collection rather than coming into Tate. And in sculpture, we also deal with the very complex kind of installation artworks, as well as kinetic artworks and light works, which have, as you can imagine, have their own particular difficulties. And we all at Tate, we always err on the side of not sending a courier if we don't need to. But obviously there's always those cases where you do need to, because of the fragility of the artwork or the complexity. So that's something that we've been trying to get our head around. So we've always had like really good documentation, doing install guides, doing packing guides, condition assessments, but it's sort of been fine-tuning that to kind of get over the loss of having that face-to-face person. So where, you know, it's very easy to misunderstand a written document. So how do we fine-tune it, because we don't have that person there to actually explain it. So one particular major touring loan that we're working on at the moment, which includes a lot of light and kinetic artworks, we've really had to think about how to deal with not being able to be there in person to actually explain how things fit together, how to maintain the artworks. That's been such a big thing that we would normally, you know, step by step go through with the borrower, sorry. So yeah, we've been fine-tuning documentation. I've also been developing my directorial video editing and video narrating skills to put little videos together, to see if that helps. Yeah, it's, you know, it's setting up interviews and meetings beforehand, particularly where there's a time difference involved, such as working with the States. So it's sort of fine-tuning the procedures that we already have in place, and it's still learning with every different loan. Yeah.
Absolutely. Moving to a kind of a registration perspective, Rebecca Wallace, can you give us an idea of your experience?
Yeah, so at Historic Royal Palaces, most of our experience is with receiving. So we don't lend out much. We're more receiving of loans. So we've had a couple of experiences. First one's mid-lockdown with decants. So returning objects that we'd installed in March last year and sadly had to return in the autumn. And most recently, we're halfway through installing our upcoming exhibition at Hampton Court. So we're now receiving objects and installing those remotely. So we've had a mix of working with lenders to work through. Some has been just a conversation at the end of the day once we've installed everything to check everything's okay, and others have been from start to finish, from sort of decanting, opening the display case, all the way through to packing and sealing the crates at the end of the day. So it's been a real mix, and has been a learning curve for us, particularly where we're working with historic buildings where Wi-Fi is not always great, and how you are managing those expectations and being clear about what is it that the lending institution wants to see. Do they want to see it from start to finish? Do they want to see the condition check, or do they want to see the install? What are their particular concerns? And a lot of planning goes into that, and setting up those meetings, and making sure the tech works, which, as I say, is a challenge for us. So we've had more experience as the receiving institution, so very much what your borrower is trying to work out, and make sure that lenders are happy.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot going on, both receiving and then sending out. I'm sure of that. Emily, how about you?
Yeah, I just want to say it's wonderful to be here with you all to talk about this shared experience we're all going through. As an exhibitions registrar, I've coordinated several exhibitions during the pandemic where many virtual couriers have been required by the lender to observe unpacking, condition checking, and install. One of the first that I worked on, I had the opportunity to work with Carla. I've also been a bookend courier for shipments for other colleagues, where courier could not, ride on a truck or be on the flight with the work. I've helped with developing a waiver and procedures for an in-person courier, which we've already had, for a piece that had to travel with a courier and they were comfortable sending someone. So that was an interesting process, and just lots of experience in the whole trial and error process in terms of technology usage. So being a touring registrar for a couple exhibitions where I haven't been able to travel to the next venue, the most difficult in my recent memory was an exhibition by Beatriz Gonzalez that first, most of the work originated in Colombia, first traveled to the Perez Art Museum Miami, and then came to Houston. From there was returning to Colombia, to a venue in Colombia. And it was on view October through December of 2020. So the borders were closed to passenger travel in and out of Colombia, but they still required a museum representative to oversee condition checking and install. Luckily, we had her artist assistant there who was able to work with us. And we had arranged for, video calls for complicated pieces and hour loans to the exhibition. Primarily used WhatsApp to communicate, but overall it did not go as planned whatsoever. No damage occurred, but they had no Wi-Fi in the gallery. There was a language barrier. It was a struggle all around, but we made it happen. And I'm working on another exhibition right now called Electrifying Design. It's entirely lamps, and they're all in various states of being able to be electrified. So each piece is quite complicated. So it is on view right now, but preparing for that to go to the next venue in Atlanta where I cannot travel. So yeah.
I now have so many more questions for you, but those will come later. Thank you. And finally, Rebecca, Hellen. The fact that there are two Rebeccas on this that's why I keep feeling very formally addressing you both by first and last name, but yes. What about your experiences? Yeah.
Thanks, Vanessa, and lovely to see everybody. So I joined the National Trust last June, and my experiences have been both in terms of virtual couriering and virtual condition checking. So just to remind everyone of the context for that, there are well over 200 properties with collections that relate to my field, that is paintings conservation, and there's 13,500 paintings in the collection. They are across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So my new context is very different to that tight museum situation where everything's relatively close by and documentation is held in central areas, and there are perhaps smaller teams. I mean, I know Tate, where I used to be, is multi-sited, but it hasn't got 200 sites. And so there's that situation where you're not necessarily working with a conservator on site if it's something that's going out and you're working with property staff. Although sometimes you do, and Siobhan Barrett will speak to that later on as well. I've also been involved in a team of fantastic colleagues, and I must say they've been brilliant at this, who are looking at policy and frameworks for doing this. So that kind of devolved model where you trickle down the information to a very large number of staff and try and make it as clear as possible to them what the protocol might be, what options there are for technology. And that is all happening now, so I can't offer you a complete and finalised last word on what we're doing. But definitely, I've had lots of experiences, right from when we were a tiny small team with everyone on furlough, through to, you know, the period of time later on last year when there were more staff around, and then a contraction again. So all of those different scenarios.
Great, thanks. Yeah, no, just what now you mentioning something about policy and frameworks. I do think that right now at many institutions across the world, we're all trying to come up with policies and frameworks to kind of try to figure this out. So I'm really glad we're sharing some of this right now. Be very helpful in terms of collaboration. So thank you all. This next question, I mean, many of you mentioned this already. It's about technology and how it all works. So, I mean, Curtis has mentioned obviously that this kind of sort of couriering or condition assessing from afar has happened quite a bit already. But, you know, I know we've all had a shaky connection or had to turn our cameras off on Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to start with you, Emily, because you mentioned that recent experience that you had with kind of, it sounded like technology was going all wrong. Could you tell us about what kind of technological kit you've used and what worked and what just seemed to not work at all?
Sure. So I feel like we've come a long way since since then. And, you know, in the instance where we weren't able to have a good connection, I asked them to, you know, film, you know, document through photos and send to me later. And I was available, you know, by text and over phone if they came across a question. But some of the issues came where, you know, they misunderstood what exactly we wanted to see. And, you know, I wanted to see the unpacking of the crate because that was the most precarious part. And once they got me on the phone, they were like, okay, it's out of the crate. What's next? And I was like, oh. But all of the entire registration department, we've been kind of experimenting with different technologies. And so I'll kind of go from like worst to my preference. You know, using a tablet, you know, terrible camera quality. It's difficult for the filmer to manage. You know, I've been on both sides of this, you know, having to be the filmer and watching someone. We purchased a GoPro in the very beginning because we had this idea that someone could just wear it and that would leave your hands free. But it doesn't, you know, give you an accurate representation of any kind of reality with the fisheye lens. There was a lag in terms of trying to watch it in real time. So it's better for, you know, filming first and viewing later. One of the fanciest pieces of technology we acquired through our IT department is something called RealWear goggles. They're mostly meant for like oil and gas industry, and you can actually view a document in the goggles so you could be potentially looking at a condition report and filming what you're looking at and have, you know, other people watching what you're seeing. So we purchased these goggles for a test run, and it belongs to our IT department. So if we want to use it, we have to go through them to borrow it. And the one drawback was you can only hear the person who's wearing the goggles. So a gimbal is another thing that we purchased, and our
Sorry, can I quickly ask really fast, how much are these goggles? Because they sound amazing, but are they expensive?
I was trying to find the price before this, and I was like, you can only get a quote. So I imagine they're pricey. The gimbal, however, is much more affordable. It's like a handheld. You guys have probably seen something like this where, you know, you can put your phone into it and it is kind of like a steady cam for your phone. But it does take quite a bit of playing with and learning how to use it. I made the mistake of just grabbing it and being like, okay, I'm ready for the call, and it's it's correcting and doing all these things. So it definitely had a learning curve for people who maybe are not as familiar with it. But for me, and this is like kind of the lowest level, but I had the most success with having just a laptop on a cart for an overview. And then also was on, the Zoom call or what have you on my phone. So when we wanted a closer look, I could jump in and show them, but I was able to be, taking photos and documenting and be free for other things, because that's where I think it gets really difficult, especially as a registrar. You're overseeing the entirety of the install, but you're stuck, because you have to be holding something, be participating in this. So having the most helpful, piece of technology is maybe also another human, if you can have one, someone who can help fill in on those virtual courier appointments, has been really helpful. And also the software is a consideration. Like at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, we have the full suite of Microsoft, products. So our IT department is wanting us to use Teams for everything, but right now, we're more reactive to the lenders. They want to use Zoom, they want to use Google Meet. So that's kind of a difficult area too.
Right. Well, I have to admit, I feel like slightly relieved that a human is another option, because I feel like we're so close to being replaced by AI that it's good to know we're a little bit safe for a little bit longer. Thank you so much. So I muted myself. That was bound to happen. Just to pose to the rest of the panel, if anyone else wants to add something in terms of technology, because Adelina, you were saying you really liked WhatsApp in terms of sort of the immediacy of communication. I don't know if you want to speak about that any further.
Yeah, and again, it's a reminder that this happened pretty much in the earlier days, of learning how to adapt to the new reality. And I think that it allowed us to get things done and to have that quick check-in. And of course, with WhatsApp, you can exchange videos and photographs. You can mark the pictures with, and point to the areas of concerns, or ask specific questions about, well, there's an extra hole in this bracket and there is no hardware that goes in it, so why is it there? And it allows for some answers to come back quickly so that you can move on with the installation. And the other thing that maybe I forgot to mention is that the Haegu Yang installations were quite complex. They had a lot of parts and electrified elements like light bulbs and fans and scent dispensers. So there was quite a challenge in terms of arriving at an installation that, of course, the lending institution had a good understanding of. But I think that the missing part, and something that we really had to adapt to quickly, was the fact that the artist couldn't travel and be present for the installation. I think that's something specific to contemporary art. We're so used as contemporary art curators to having the artist there to be the final one to approve the look and feel of the installation. And I think even after we consider the installation done, there was this feeling that, could it really be exactly the way the artist would have liked it to be? And I think that that's something that hopefully, when this gets under control, we can avoid, but it was something that technology could not do justice to. So just wanted to bring that up. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. Does anyone else, before I move on to the next question, does anyone else have a kind of, you can raise your hand or jump in. Yep, Curtis.
Sorry, yeah, just unmuted there. Yeah, I spoke to colleagues of mine at Artwork Exhibition Services and passed them on the topics, and they echoed the having another person. They from there, JP was saying having a dedicated person on a decent camera Even if you don't have that live link, you are at least able to take a recording. A live link is obviously much more, preferable. But using phones and all the rest of it, they are absolutely brilliant backup. But if virtual couriering is if you know it's going to happen and you can plan around it, having someone from the gallery or from the tech team with a decent camera that knows how to use it and has set it up well, literally I don't think there's anything else that can replace that. So one tech can be unwrapping it or condition checking, and one person is just on the camera, because undoubtedly, everyone else, it's a busy time when you're setting up an exhibition. So expecting, can you just hold the camera? Doesn't always work. So yeah, if you can, get that extra person in there for that. So
thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think in terms of resourcing, knowing that you need an extra person. Go on, sorry, Rebecca. Helen.
Yeah, just to back up Curtis, really, all the installs and de-installs we've done, we've always had a dedicated person to hold the camera during those installs and de-installs and the condition checking, and having a continual verbalization of what's going on as well. So it's almost a continual commentary. Has been something that has been really useful for us, but it does flag up that a virtual courier is not necessarily the cheapest option. We all think because we're not traveling, somebody's not traveling with the object, that it will somehow be cheaper, but having that additional person to hold the camera is a resource that we all do need to factor in. And certainly with in the past, we've done where people haven't sent couriers and you've had 2 people from the borrowing institution doing that condition check. So it's a similar process to that in a way, but certainly we found that the best way to do it is to have that dedicated person for the camera, so that you're not trying to do too much and you can focus on that condition check and the objects that you're being required to look after.
Absolutely. Rebecca, Helen, I see you were raising your hand following on from that.
Just a quick note on technology and its availability and the pressure on staff to use their own devices, which I think comes naturally because, you might have WhatsApp on your own phone, but not on your work phone. And, I agree, Emily, it's great when you've got that kind of dual option. You have a screen where you're connected and then someone's WhatsApping you photographs, and Adelina, that immediacy is really great. But I think at the National Trust, we're trying to be cautious and remember what our staff are actually provided with, as it were. The other thing is that connectivity is a massive issue in our properties. They're in remote places. Often the building walls are so thick you can't get a phone signal or a Wi-Fi signal, and there's only so long an Ethernet cord that you can use to trail through, somewhere like Petworth House. So just a little bit of sort of thought around those issues and working out where the cutoff is. For us, certainly there will be limits, particularly for objects that we're getting ready to go out. For example, me supporting from my apartment in London, a property in Sussex, and them trying to get something ready to leave. So that kind of internal piece of work has a complexity which is sometimes tripped up by some of the technology and its limitations.
Absolutely. No, these are all incredibly good points. Right, well, I feel like technology is such a big thing, and I know there are some questions that are coming in that do relate to technology. So I think we will probably touch on this a little bit more in the Q&A. But just so, having worked on a fair few loans myself in a kind of conservation aspect, I know that a significant amount of work goes into planning, the installation, the deinstall. I mean, I know my registration colleagues at the Science Museum have like plans A to Z always, just in case. So I guess I'm just curious about the kind of contingencies that are put into place on the off chance something doesn't go to plan. So I know that it can be a very reactive thing, but also just in terms of knowing that the likelihood that something might happen, like a bad Wi-Fi connection, sort of what gets planned for in advance. So Carla, I don't know if you want to speak to that experience.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, just to also say here to basically every point that everybody's been making so far, it's so good to hear that everybody's been having the same issues. So that's reassuring to know. Yeah, so often I've been, more likely than not, I'm the actual courier overseeing one of our artworks being installed. And yeah, there's always that chance that the technology is going to fail, or it might be that the time difference is so big that we actually I can't physically do a virtual courier. That sounds wrong, but actually be the virtual courier. So we have different ways of putting contingencies in place. As I mentioned before, we always do a lot of documentation. So we'll do install guides, packing guides, condition reports. So if worse comes to the worst and everything fails, there's that documentation that should be able to steer them through. I think the thing that I've also found incredibly useful is having either an email conversation or a face-to-face kind of Teams conversation with the venue beforehand, with specifically the team that will be installing. So say that's the registrar or the tech manager, something like that. So just to talk things through before the pressurized environment of the actual install is happening. So any questions can be flagged at that point. I can sort of talk through any points where I've known particular things are likely to go wrong. So that's been incredibly useful. And then sort of on the day of you're in that moment where, you've got your Zoom call set up, everything's going swimmingly, and then connection goes. A phone call is actually, a good old fashioned phone call works really, really well, where you've got the person, the conservator or the technician who knows the artwork really well, knows the packing really well, and they can visualize it to be able to talk the borrowing venue through the issues. I think that's been really, really helpful. WhatsApp as well is super helpful, just to do those very quick either snapshots or just quick questions. But again, I've seen in the chat talking about kind of the privacy, I guess, of WhatsApp. So, but that's something, a bigger question, I suppose. But yeah, documentation and those kind of conversations. But yeah, going back to the sort of saving money through not sending a courier is kind of interesting, because obviously we always do a lot of documentation, but it's taking us longer because we're really, really going through and really making sure that it's really robust. And then we're also having all of those additional conversations plus the actual carrying out the virtual courier stage. So there is a lot of time and resource related to it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And yeah, I guess leading on from the potential for things to go wrong, and I'd like to just touch on the idea of risk, because there's a lot of risks, I think, involved with virtual couriering. So in terms of conservation, there are conservation risks, and also there are just general risks in terms of having an object without a courier, so to speak. kind of nearby. So I wanted to just first talk about conservation risk. And Rebecca, Hellen, I wondered if you might be able to provide any insight on some of the conservation risks that arise from virtual couriering, but also virtual condition assessing, which is important too.
Yeah, I think risk is a primary concern, and I am of a pragmatic philosophy, a realistic philosophy, but coming into a new organisation where I don't know the collection intimately, as I have developed in the last part of my career, I've had to think of everything very much on first principle. And so that's been my approach the whole time. And I think what I miss about the condition assessing portion of this conversation is that real live look at the surface. And so again, it's all in that situation about the relationship that you have with the staff that you're collaborating with at the other end. And I think, you know, Siobhan can speak to this as well. The experience of the person at the other end and their ability to communicate with you and discuss whether a piece, you know, of paint is raised, a crack is new, a damage is old, and all those kind of nuanced, you know, discussions one might have. It very much relies on the quality of documentation. Is there a risk there because it's too old? The experience of the staff you're collaborating with, and I've found myself in situations which I think have been really great, where I've been almost condition checking and training staff at the same time because of the turnover of staff, and there's new people and it's a new process, so, you know, younger members of staff want to come along. So all those are added risks, and I would just like to say that I haven't found myself in a high risk situation this far, but I am constantly thinking about how to avoid that. And, you know, I think that dealing with the paintings collection, which is high value, single objects, I'm not typically dealing with whole suites of pictures at the National Trust. It tends to be one or two things at a time. All of those things mean that you can think a little bit more carefully about risk, and whether there is a risk in the activity that you're doing. So.
Absolutely. In terms of, so this is either for Rebecca, Wallace, or Emily to jump in on. I know that in terms of registration and risk and insurance and kind of things that you take on when you're sending an object, is there something that you've found to be very difficult when you're approaching this sort of virtual courier or condition assessing, and in terms of like risks of objects and like I say, the kind of, I don't know, I might be getting ahead of myself when I talk about insurance, but just in terms of like the risk when it comes from your side of this process. Don't know which one of you wants to go first. Nobody, that's fine.
Well, I did want to mention just briefly, you know, like the staffing side of risk, and, you know, that, you know, in a pandemic, we are all putting ourselves at risk just being on site. And our, you know, our team members, the preparations, like art handling staff, we've definitely experienced some hang-ups in that, you know, one of our staff members tested positive on the preparations team, and then everyone had to quarantine for like 10 days, and then that stops everything and an install. But, yeah.
Yeah, I think to echo Emily, I think we're all making multiple plans, and that's where I think the conversations that you have before the install happens about what are the expectations, what are those risks that you need to be aware of. So what are the specific elements that you're looking out for instance? What are the particular concerns of the lender, and making sure that you've got you understand where the lender's coming from, particularly, and what their concerns are. It means there's a lot more planning and preparation that I think happens now. Not that it wasn't happening beforehand, but I think we're going into a lot more detail now than we were previously, and doing a lot more advanced discussions, particularly around where those risks are and where the concerns are, because you're passing that trust and responsibility on in a different way. And that relationship that's built up between lender and borrower before you come to install is absolutely crucial. And that's where a lot of the concerns can be allayed. And that's, you know, that's something that we all work on anyway, but I think it's become more crucial to have those conversations in advance, to check expectations, to have those plans in place about where the particular concerns are, so that if the tech fails, you know what you're specifically looking out for, rather than relying on the tech working all the time. You've got your backup plan and you know what to look out for.
Certainly, yeah. And I just, in terms of rounding out risk, Curtis, I would love to hear your kind of perspective on this, as being on a certain, you know, I do think you also have to take on a lot of risk. You might be on mute.
There we go.
There you go.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Certainly over the years, you know, you'll open a crate and you'll not always be met with what you want to see. And at that point, if it hasn't been packed, if the lender or the tech's at the other end, if I'm honest, it's most common with contemporary artists. Organizations, museums and galleries are normally better, or you know, pretty watertight with their packing. But you know, you open a crate and there's debris in the bottom of the crate, or you're seeing something in a different light to when it was packed, so you notice damage, or you know, might well be old damage, but something that's not on the report. And from a technician's point of view, and from, you know, from the curators in, you know, the who it's been lent to, you've just that moment that everything stops. You then got to document it, get hold of someone at the other end if there isn't a curator with you. Whereas if it's documented to begin with, when it goes into the crate, it's only, and really, really well, then it's only if it's, you know, just it's mitigating that risk. There's going to be far less time spent finding out if something's new or just been missed off the paperwork or missed off the photos. So it's like you were saying earlier, is it going to be cheaper not sending a courier? Not necessarily. More work is going to have to go into the prep. More work has to go into when it's received. More people are going to be needed, both ends, to do that prep. And you know, so but it's documentation. It's all down to the prep work and what you hand over to the technician and the establishment at the other end is something they can work with easily. And it just makes everything so much easier. It really does.
Always comes back to documentation. That's what
yeah.
Thanks so much. Time is, I was just looking at the time and it's flying. In 5 minutes, I want to move on to the Q&A because I can see we're getting some really good questions in from the audience. So just a final one from me that I don't think we have time to hear from everyone on. So if you really have something that you'd like to say about it, maybe raise a hand, let me know. It's just, I'm curious on people's opinions of if you think virtual couriering is here to stay. I think it's here to stay in general. Like, I think it exists now, so it's here. But if you think it's going to become the primary way of doing things, because, you know, it's obviously very sustainable, or do you think it's just going to be an added alternative in our arsenal if we, you know, for example, if there's lack of resource or it's a trusted institution, just to know, yeah, just to hear what you guys think about that. Gonna pick one of you. Carla, yes.
Yeah, I agree. I think it definitely is here to stay. And yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see to what greater and lesser extent. And I think also something that might affect it is kind of the policies that we end up putting in place. You know, can we use WhatsApp? Can we use these technologies in the long term? So that's going to be really interesting. But I definitely think it will be something that's part of our arsenal. You know, it can be, it definitely has its drawbacks, but the positives are massive as well. You know, not having to travel halfway around the world just to see one artwork be installed that you know is otherwise is fairly. I don't want to, you know, obviously it's difficult to say because there's the, you know, if an artwork is strong enough to be able to travel on its own, then that's fantastic. And you know, it's more about thinking, you know, helping the institution to install the work, for example. But they have an incredibly good team. So, you know, it's more about just adding those extra supports in for them. So I think it's incredibly useful in that way. But I think it's also really important that, you know, there are some artworks that just need that person, you know, because of the fragility. Adelina, I really like the fact that you said about the feel of an artwork. I mean, the second, I hadn't thought of it that way, but the second you said that, I was like, yes, actually, there's so many artworks that I can relate that to, where you really need that person. There's also things that we miss out not going, you know, connecting with different institutions, that networking opportunity, speaking with artists, speaking with contemporaries, you know, that's really, really useful. So I hope that this is just another tool and that we don't lose face-to-face altogether. And I think that's probably the case.
I completely agree with you. Sorry, Adelina, were you? Oh. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add that, for example, sometimes, you know, we make acquisitions, and also I'm speaking from a contemporary perspective, but there are acquisitions that sometimes the first instance that we as an organization have an opportunity to learn about installing it is when it's asked for a loan. And there's so much institutional memory that gets built through the staff that travels to do that kind of work that, you know, without a real person couriering it, that knowledge will never be part of the institution.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I will say I love all the virtual stuff, but I do miss the face-to-face. It would have been great to be doing this in person and to speak with you all afterwards. Rebecca, yeah.
Just to say that I think, to echo what both Carla and Adelina have said, I think it will become another tool in our arsenal. I can see us using it more for deinstallations than I can for installations, particularly for those contemporary pieces where you need the artist's input and to get that sense right. I can see, and to build up those relationships. So if you've got somebody physically there during install, then it might be that you have built up that relationship, you can see how they work, and therefore you're more comfortable with a virtual deinstall, for instance. So I think we will start to use it a bit more flexibly, and we'll start to move away from a flat policy of either everything needing a career or everything being virtual, or to moving towards a much more risk managed matrix, looking at the object and the venue's track history and the staff that they have in place, and all of those elements, to form a decision about not only do we send a courier, but what type of courier should that be. So I think it's going to be very much more of a development of a framework that we all operate on, and we decide on a case-by-case basis, rather than moving away from those institutional policies that says everything goes with a career or everything is virtual. I think we'll move away to an individual decision.
Sure. Rebecca, Hellen, can you say this, but in the next maybe 1 minute, if that's possible? I'm sorry to hurry you up, just so I can get to the Q&A.
Sure, not at all, that's fine. Just to remind everybody, the other aspect of this is, will your institution be expecting you to form an opinion on the condition of something remotely, or even, dare I say it, a treatment proposal remotely, and that there are some boundaries around physically not seeing the object, I think, in that instance, which everyone has to think really carefully about. I'm not saying never, but I would say whilst virtual couriering is probably around to stay with certain parameters, I think that some aspects of expecting staff to carry out condition assessment or treatment proposals, maybe more complex to tease out and need a lot more thought, and is much more of an absolutely case-by-case basis. So that's it.
No, that's a great point. Thank you for making it. Great. So I've just been watching. The questions are coming in thick and fast, and they all look great. So I will ask the question, and then if you guys can either just raise a hand or just let me know if you'd like to answer it, then I'll call on you in that way. So this is one that multiple people have asked and are curious about, and it is, I'd like to hear if any of the panelists have opted to work with a contract conservator or registrar instead of opting for the virtual install. The answer looks like it might be no.
We haven't yet. We've definitely. I think maybe my colleagues in paper conservation, anybody in the chat can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of our photography conservator was actually based in Paris, so it meant that she was able to, so she wasn't necessarily third party, she was still tape, but because she was based in Paris, she was able to go to a Paris venue to deal with the work. We've definitely talked about, ex-members of Tate who work all, now work all over the world, and can we utilise that experience? So yeah, we haven't necessarily done third party, but potentially we might do in the future.
From my point of view, we explored it. So we explored contracting a third party textile conservator to help us out with the loan that we had, that was due to be deinstalled, and that was going to be a combination of third party conservator and virtual courier from our end, with virtual conversation with our textile conservator. In the end, we were able to physically send somebody to deinstall, but we certainly explored that option of employing a local conservator to deinstall on our behalf, with a textile conservator on on the video chat to guide through as well.
Thanks. So we have another question now. So this is relating to condition reports, and I might just try to combine some condition report questions into one. So there's the question of, have you changed how you do condition reports for virtual couriering? If so, what do you now include which you didn't before? And then there's another question kind of with that is about focusing on digital condition reports and high resolution photography, and if, yeah, if this is something now that you're incorporating.
I think that there aren't the resources to do high resolution photography at the National Trust, and just in general, we are reviewing the way that we structure our condition assessment and condition reports in tandem with quite a big internal piece around communications for collections, care and conservation. So it's all wrapped up in something that I think was already planned before I joined the institution and was under review. So I can't say we're specifically changing anything, but we are we're conscious now of some of the changes that have occurred in this last year. Yeah.
Carla, have your templates changed at all?
No, and I think because we don't send couriers with all of our artworks, so we already do have quite, so our condition report looks very simple. So thinking about kind of where there's language differences and that kind of thing, we do try and keep our condition reports quite simplistic, so with lots of images already, and with quite, you know, simple short paragraphs. So, but yeah, I think the thing that perhaps I have been thinking about is how to make them even, I think I'm repeating myself, but try just to make them more and more robust, and also thinking about how to use pictures a lot more. So not necessarily high res, but maybe using color coding. So if there's a language barrier, that's something that can be utilized instead. So it's especially for the way things are packed, but also for installs. So using install diagrams more than install guidelines, for example. And then I think, yeah, the biggest difference is doing installation videos, which we haven't really done in the past. And yeah, that's something, yeah, that I've sort of had to learn how to do video editing and things like that quite quickly. But that's been super useful, quite easy to do, but time consuming again. But I think that's probably the major difference. And then sending everything in advance so that if there are any questions, then we can deal with that in advance.
Great. So this might be more to do with site registration issue. So for people who have managed incoming loans and exhibitions, how do you cope with multi-lender cases where you might have to be on Zoom with more than one lender at a time?
Luckily, I've not had to deal with multiple lenders at once, but I know some colleagues who have, and it's just a matter of, you know, adding them all to the same meeting. If, you know, it's just a juggling schedules as it is with all virtual courier appointments, but just trying to make that work.
Seems reasonable. A question relating to the installations of complicated works. And so this is, I think, Carla, but also Adelina in terms of contemporary art. Physically witnessing installs of complicated works is always an eye-opener to see various working processes and possibilities. With virtual couriering, Are you available during the whole install or at specific points?
I can speak on that, but Adelina, please jump in as well. So yeah, so that's definitely been something that takes quite a bit of thought. I think how I've done it, and this others might disagree, but that I go through the install in my mind and kind of think, where are those key points where they need somebody? Because I'm thinking about the kind of, it's very tiring both for the courier to kind of sit watching something. I mean, had long Zoom meetings and you feel your head's going to explode, and that's really, really true. Somebody yesterday at the Icon Paintings meeting was talking about motion sickness, and I can definitely agree with that if you're kind of watching somebody moving around, that's quite intense. But also, if you don't want to add extra pressure to an already pressurized install. So definitely the way that I get around that is by just focusing on the key aspects of when particularly fragile parts are either coming down or going up, or there's something that I know is particularly complex. Yeah, and then at the end, sort of looking at it as an overview and just going through things. I haven't really talked about condition checking, which I've realised I'm a conservator and I haven't talked about condition checking, but I have struggled with doing any kind of condition checking using technology. I don't know if anybody else has agreed with that. It's very difficult to get the detail and to really focus in on things. So I've been heavily relying on the conservators at the venue to do that for me, and then then they are able to point anything in particular out to me once the work's been installed or as the installation is happening, and I can jump onto the phone call or the video call when they need me to. So yeah, so it's kind of making myself available during the day, but not necessarily being on the call for that entire day.
Yeah, that's a good point about condition assessing, because in just true nerdy museum fashion, yesterday I was in a workshop and we were practicing virtual condition checking, and I picked a really kind of mean object, which was a plate which I knew had just gotten a little crack out of the dishwasher, and you just can't really see it. So it's kind of, if you're just holding it up to a laptop. So it's definitely about kind of trust in the other conservators, and then getting creative with your technology, I suppose, which is important. So coming to another question, what about insurance issues? If an object is transported and damaged en route and there is no accompanying conservator, could the insurance company say there should have been and not pay out? Which is a very interesting question, which I think we might not have an answer to yet. But is this something that is being thought about? I would think, perhaps. I know people might not want to speak on this as experts because we haven't really, it's so new.
I can pass a couple of comments from previous panels and previous conversations with insurers about this sort of topic. Most insurance policies don't specify a courier. So in that regard, whether they pay out or not isn't down to whether there's a courier. And particularly with the kind of works that we're all transporting, we're using fine art agents, and I've noticed a couple of questions in the chat about airports and being able to see those elements. As a courier, you are reliant on your transport agent anyway in those situations. Your courier is, if they're allowed in the airport warehouse, they're there as a guest of the agent, not necessarily by right. So that's where working with a fine art agent is incredibly crucial. And I've had instances in the past where I haven't been able to have a career in the airport for plane transfers, for long voyages. There are some airport warehouses where you can't have a career, so you are working remotely then anyway, so you're asking a third party to do that on your behalf. So the fact that we're not physically sending couriers in at the moment for those journeys isn't something new. That's something we've always had to do, and our insurance policies have always worked that way. So I think it's that management of risk is something that we're all doing anyway. So the fact that we're not necessarily physically sending a courier in some instances isn't something new.
Just wanted to add in, echoes a question in the chat that bookend couriers are being used quite frequently, at least with the Museum of Fine Arts. So, it might not be a continuous courier, but, in between the airport and the institution, or vice versa, we've utilized a lot of bookend couriers that are just in their own car, or hiring someone to be in a follow car, outside of the truck, and we've had success with that. But yeah, just really having trust in your fine arts agents, and communicating with them. And in some instances we've had, you're not allowed to take photos or video, but there's been, people are making a little bit more exceptions for those kinds of things now.
Yeah, Rebecca.
Just to say, there are also cultural and economic variations across all of these scenarios as well, and we're used to dealing flexibly with those situations. And I think everyone should be proud and confident about how far we've come in terms of packing artworks, protecting them in transit, those kind of high standards that we're reaching, I think, globally, and particularly for museums and national collections. Maybe occasionally not in the private market, if I dare say that, but I think we're hitting some high standards generally, and that reflects well on on the profession. We mitigate well for risks in these circumstances.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, you're right about that. So this is something I think I might direct toward Curtis or maybe Adelina, which is relating to conservators and information. So I'm curious what information you most need from the conservator to help you with installations. So I mean, because we get I'm a conservator, we get a slightly funny reputation of being very hard on people and kind of, we're very strict. But what is the kind of the information that you find the most helpful from us when you're doing installations and we're not nearby, let's say?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last.
So you go first, Adelina. Okay, no, it's on me. Yeah, I did actually prepare a bit of a list for this one because I figured it was going to come up.
Excellent.
Yeah. Basically, I mean, in the condition report and the packing or unpacking instructions, it's really good to know about previous repairs and consolidations, what materials it's made from, because we can't always tell, and it's actually surprisingly common that it's not in the report. Certainly not all of the materials, and I mean, certainly if it's a painting, everything from the painting through the frame, the hangings, the lot. Known fragility points. So sometimes when it's been restored really well, you can't always tell where at first glance, and having some good notes with photographs showing you where those repairs and the conservation has happened. The best one is where it can be handled. Certainly if it's an awkward sculpture or something extremely fragile, it's again surprisingly common. We are left trying to figure out where we think it is best, where something is best handled or supported. Thankfully we've had nothing go wrong, but if the notes are in there saying don't handle it here, it's had a previous repair, or there's a hairline crack which you're not necessarily going to see in all lighting, it's really good. Do you expect any degradation or change because of atmospheric changes? Certainly, it's so regular in furniture and like old gilt and wooden frames. They're going in and out of lorries, crates, different organizations. Over a long exhibition, if you're hitting an exhibition in the springtime, the galleries atmospherics will change a lot as it moves. If it's on for 3 months and it moves into the summer, and then when you're going to take it down, everything's cracking, moving, and just again it goes back to documentation. Lots of really good packing photos, and I would rather have to sift my way through a binder of photos and notes than have to figure it out. So I'm sure Adelina will say the same thing. It's better to have too much information and filter out what you need than have to figure it out or scratch when you take the lid off. I'll hand over.
Yeah, I think my answer is going to be a bit more general and not so specific because, luckily we do have a conservation team in-house, and they're true partners in everything we do. And in regards to this particular scenario and what has helped, and it's always been great to see my colleagues in action, so to say, how flexible and creative they are in their thinking. And I think that their knowledge of materials always comes in at the right time and at the right moment to save a situation. And I think that in the case of Haegyuyang emergence, I think that our conservator colleagues were there to support and to make up maybe for the lack of the presence of the lenders or the artists. So I think that they're always they're needed in so many ways. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I also just have a quick question, and we're almost coming up to the end, which is such a shame. I feel like this is such a good conversation. But I think I missed this, and I might have dismissed the question earlier. There's something that was asked about virtual signing. So I think that means like a virtual signature in terms of condition checking and the paperwork and sort of the kind of that documentation that we get everyone to sign to make sure we're all in agreement. And I think, so I'm just going to ask how that is managed and how these virtual signatures are managed. Emily, yeah.
So we also, have to use virtual signatures for loan documents. So I think it's a matter of getting with your legal team and seeing, what you can really allow for. I know I've gotten loan agreements that's just somebody took a picture with their cell phone, or we don't always have like the physical agreement. It's up to what the lenders can provide, but we use Adobe Acrobat DC, and you can easily insert a signature field that requires the signer to register, and then it gives the signature a more official feel. But yeah, I would recommend talking to your legal team and seeing, you know, what you really do require.
Great, thank you. And then I think we just have time for one more quick question. This is an interesting question. I'd like to hear the answer for this. So how are the panelists planning the schedule of an install with virtual courier appointments? It's clearly taking much more time. Are you able to get your administration to consider allowing a longer install, deinstall time to account for this? My instinct says no, but does anyone else have a different experience?
I can jump in because we're right in the middle of an install. We luckily have been able to, because the venues aren't open yet to the public. So we've been able to shift that forward slightly so that we've got a bit more time to manage the lenders, who some of whom are sending physical couriers and some who are virtual. So we've got a real mix. So we've been able to spread our install out over a bit of a longer period of time. That has meant more negotiation, I think, with the lenders, because we're installing over that longer period of time and everybody wants to be last in the showcase. So that's, and we're installing a lot earlier than you would in a normal situation, because we're not only getting the exhibition ready, but we're getting the rest of the site ready for reopening. So we've had to spread it out. So that's where I think we've probably had more pushback is from lenders saying, I don't want to install so early, rather than from our senior management going, you can't have 2-3 weeks to install. It's actually been the other way around.
That's interesting, actually. Thank you for that. That's, yeah. Well, thank you all so much for this very interesting conversation. I regret to say I have to pass back to Amy now, but I hope that this is inspiring people to think about the upcoming, very soon, call for papers that we're going to put out on this, this topic. So Amy, back to you.
Thanks so much, Vanessa, and to all our panelists. I am actually really sad that it's 7:30 and that we only booked an hour and a half for this. I know people have lives they have to get back to. This has been such an interesting discussion, not only from the panelists, so we really thank you for giving up your time and having this conversation, especially those of you who were dealing with time differences as well. But also, I just want to shout out to all the participants. I mean, the chat has been so interesting, and I think one of the things that we are definitely going to do is we're going to keep a record of the chat. And like I said, we've got this upcoming symposium at the end of July. And I think what we'll do is a lot of the points that have been made and a lot of the questions that have come up, we will put as themes and try to work their way into this next event, because clearly there's still so much more. We've just scratched the surface of this. So a huge thank you again to Vanessa for moderating, to all of our panelists for giving up their time, and also to the events teams of both the Modern Materials Network and the Care of Collections group for putting this together. And I hope everyone has a great evening, and we hope to see you at the next event. Thank you, everybody.